to our viewers and ladies and gentlemen. You are watching News First. Today we are going to discuss about Sri Lanka's debt sustainability and is Sri Lanka's economy in peril. To discuss this and to provide their expert opinion, I have a distinguished panel to discuss this issue. Today, the discussion, we are joined, Dr. W. Wijewardhena, the former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank, is joining with us for the discussion. Welcome, Dr. Wijewardhena. And also, we have Mr. Chandra Jayaratne, who is the former chairman of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Thank you, Mr. Jayaratne, for joining the discussion. And my third panelist is Mr. Murtaza Jafferjee. He's the chairman of Advocata Institute, and he's also the CEO of JB Securities. Welcome, Murtaza, for the discussion. Before I move on and handing over to our distinguished panel to talk about this issue, I would like to first set the context on what is Sri Lanka's debt issue and to just provide an outlook of the gravity of the situation. But till I present the slide, I invite our viewers to take a guess on what would be Sri Lanka's debt stock. Now, in this slide, you can see our debt stock is about 13 trillion. And I know when you say about 13 trillion, no one would understand, no one will be able to imagine what's the quantity. Just to give you a color of the debt stock, it is about nearly about 70 times of the transaction we did with Hambantota port in 2018. So we need to, our debt stock is about 70 times of and the domestic debt is also about another 6.6 trillion, and which adds to our total debt for 13 trillion. And our foreign debt component is also about 35 times of the Hambantota port deal. And the main question is, to whom do we owe money? And you can clearly see there are three main tiers. One is the multilateral tier, which we owe about 23% on our total foreign debt, which is in terms of rupee terms, it's in terms of US dollar terms, it's about 8 billion, about 8 times of Hambantota port only for multilateral agencies, and bilateral and financial markets. And there was a discussion whether do we owe China as a country beyond our affordability. And you can see in terms of bilateral loans, it's about 2.2%, and with Import Bank of China, it's about 7.4% only in our foreign debt portfolio. But the bigger question is, as you can see, as I have highlighted in red, the international sovereign bonds, which takes about 43% of our debt stock. And that's the biggest issue, because in financial markets, we have borrowed beyond our affordability, in high interest rates, in dollar terms, in shorter maturity. In summary, that's the problem that we are talking about. And if I look at the domestic debt, which is also about 35 times of Hambantota port, only the domestic component, as you can see, the majority of our domestic debt is in treasury bonds. And the problem here is, or the concern here is, as you can see, out of that treasury bonds, about 35% is owned by EPF, that is the hard-earned money of Sri Lankan people who have contributed for the EPF, and also about 12% is on commercial banks. But of course, all this debt we don't have to pay it on a Monday morning, next Monday morning, not that we have to pay all day. There's a schedule to be paid. So when we look at the external schedule, this is from Fitch rating, you can see from 2020 to 2025, we have to pay about 4 billion US dollars till 2025. Actually, in 2025, it hits 5 billion. And what you see in the red color and yellow color is basically the interest. In red color, it's the international sovereign bond interest, and in green color, it's the project and syndicated loan interest. And you can see, in terms of our debt stock, it's mainly the interest component that we have to pay. And if I were to further explain, about 47% of our entire government revenue we have to pay just for the interest payment of this debt stock. So that's the broader overview. So with that, I would like to start the discussion with that introductory, the opening remark. I would like to first move my question to Dr. W. A. Wijewardhena. First, for Sri Lankan people, Dr. Wijewardhena, what is the problem? Of course, the numbers looks bigger, it's 13 trillion, but what is the problem with the debt stock we have, and how should we overcome it? I'll start from you, Dr. Wijewardhena.
Yeah, Dhananath, thank you very much. And but of course, the Sri Lankans should be worried not only about the central government debt which you have presented. We should be worried about the country debt. So, country debt consists of the debt secured by the central government from foreign sources, plus the private sector entities that have borrowed from the foreign sources. So, these private sector entities include the borrowings of the central bank as well. So, if we take a stock of the total country debt, Dhananath, as at end of say 2019, the central bank debt was foreign debt was only about 35 billion US dollars. But the private sector also has borrowed some 21 billion. The leading private sector entities, the commercial banks and all these institutions. So the total foreign debt owed by Sri Lanka is 56 billion US dollars. So when you add that to the local domestic debt of the central government, the total country debt is about say 110% of GDP today. So if you add the recent borrowings of the central bank after this COVID-19 pandemic from various other central banks and various other sources, the total private debt is now about say 25 billion US dollars. So therefore, our debt liability is increasing day by day. So why should Sri Lankans be worried about this? Is because earlier, Dhananath, it was a dollar problem. Because for example, if you take the private sector entities which had borrowed from foreign sources, they had rupees. So they had to convert the rupees into dollars in order to make payments to their creditors. But after COVID-19 pandemic, it is not only a dollar problem, it's a dollar plus rupee problem. Because the private sector entities which had borrowed heavily from abroad, they had suffered heavy losses during the COVID-19 pandemic. The income level has gone up, except the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, because Central Bank of Sri Lanka can always print rupees and convert the rupees into dollars if it has dollars. So all these institutions, therefore, they have a double problem today. Problem number one for Sri Lanka is we don't have enough foreign exchange. Problem number two is the private sector entities which have borrowed about say 25 billion US dollars up to today, they don't have rupees to pay their foreign obligations. So we have a serious problem. They have now this is a classic situation like countries like Mexico, Chile, Argentina, which ran into the external debt problem. And because these countries didn't have enough domestic currency plus foreign currency in order to serve their foreign debt. So our problem today as a nation, we have to now look at the total country debt, not the debt of the central government alone. The total country debt is about say 56 billion at the end of 2019. Now it is about say 60 billion as at today. So we need money to pay, and that problem is there, and that is the biggest problem we are having, because when it comes to domestic debt, Dhananath, it's one party of the country is owing that debt to another party. In other words, we owe it to ourselves. So as a result, it's a redistribution of the domestic assets. But when it comes to foreign debt, the money will have to go out of Sri Lanka. So there's a real sacrifice. So the real sacrifice will come as your total, because you had presented the graph for up to 2025, which had been, I think, prepared by Fitch Rating. That includes only the debt owed by the central government. But if you look at the total debt of Sri Lanka within the next 12-month period, that comes to 7 billion US dollars. So it's not the 4.5 billion that the government has borrowed. There is another 2.5 billion which Sri Lanka's private sector will have to pay. So we need 7 billion US dollars in the next 12-month period in order to make these payments. And if you look at the total Sri Lanka's foreign reserves as at today, after Sri Lanka had paid this 1 billion international sovereign bond in on 4th of October, it has come down to 5.1 billion. So how now our present problem is, without we have no any way of paying out the entire country debt. So that is our problem. So unless we borrow abroad, we can't do that. But you had already pointed out that the international sovereign bonds have become largest source of foreign exchange for Sri Lanka. That particular part is now lost to Sri Lanka because after this US government had issued this warning against Sri Lanka that Sri Lanka should choose proper priorities with China and USA. In the international sovereign bond market, the secondary market prices of our bonds have dropped from say 100 US dollars to now 75 US dollars per $100 bond, which should mature after in July 2021. So our yield rate has gone up to 45% in this particular bond. So if we are to go to the international sovereign bond market and raise money in order to make these payments, we will have to pay a very high interest yield in order to secure money. So our problem is not that. I will come to that later after we are going to discuss it, because we have to attack the problem at the source rather than at the end. Now we have been trying to solve the problem at the end rather than at the source. So I will discuss this later.
Thank you, Dr. Wijewardhena. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting point that you brought out. It's not only the government debt, but also the private sector debt, and that also has to be paid in dollar terms. Thank you very much for that insight. Now I would like to move my attention to Mr. Chandra Jayaratne. Mr. Jayaratne, you are representing the private sector, and you have been the chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. It looks like still the private sector has not really taken this debt issue as a concern, or did I understand it right? And in your opinion, what would be the impact for the private sector businesses with this debt issue? Is my question to you, Mr. Jayaratne.
In the private sector does understand, but I think political pressures and political niceties prevent them, I think, from being classically correct. But I'm sure the boardrooms are filled with risk analysis and what they should be doing. Because not many may remember the good old days when we had to open a letter of credit. Our letter of credit from Bank of Ceylon or People's Bank were not accepted. It had to be cross-guaranteed by a covering guarantee from an international bank. And those who did not have that facility could not do an import. So there was that regime which was not forgotten probably today, but it will reflect that that's the kind of situation that will come. I think Vijay raised a very important point, which is, I believe, a lot of the free cash flows upon which people estimated and borrowed funds in the private sector output is being hampered not only by COVID but by the absence of the necessary raw material. Once it is even made, we have other problems of transportation and markets. So therefore, both imports and exports are going to be badly affected. What will this lead to? With the credit ratings coming down, the private sector who had been borrowing abroad will also have to pay a very high interest rate to get their facilities. And already the latest Morgan and Stanley published by which was published 2 days ago by Goldman Sachs, puts us in a second category after Iraq as the largest those whose economies are in doubt. Now, all these things will impact the private sector in their trading abilities. But more importantly, when people are thinking of contracting for the future, they will limit. People who want to invest here will consider whether it is a safe entity point to come and invest. Doing uncertainty of the exchange rate, the uncertainties that are going to cover business, the risks of how much can the hedge margins be, how much will they have to borrow, will they get credit? If credit is not being allowed, what will happen for our imports and exports? What will happen if our letters of credit are not accepted? So I think the risks facing the private sector is far greater since the recent happenings. It's not only COVID driven, but it's driven by a few other really foolish decisions, which again can talk about later. Some of the recent things, including some of the new tax thoughts to the incentives that have been given, which are going to backfire on Sri Lanka's debt issue.
Thank you, Mr. Jayaratne. Thank you very much. So the main concern that you highlighted was that if our letter of credits being rejected, or if they were reluctant to provide that letter of credit, and it will impact the entire business cycle. And as Dr. Wijewardhena mentioned, a significant proportion when private sector comes to repay it, that there will be a bit of a tight situation. Murtaza, I would like to ask, so what is the solution do we have at hand? What can we do about it if we were to overcome this situation? And also you while highlighting the solutions at hand, and that's my question to you, Mr. Jafferjee.
Thank you, Dhananath. I do have the benefit of some visual slides which I would like to share with the audience at the moment. What I would like to show first is that this kind of illustrates what Dr. Wijewardhena already mentioned about the private sector component, and this is shown in terms of GDP. Now, what is this private sector debt for our audience? Mainly, it would be borrowings by banks who have borrowed offshore, and all of that borrowing would not necessarily be lent offshore. So if you look at an indicator called net foreign assets, at the moment that is negative, indicating that offshore borrowings have been used to finance credit domestically. Now, what's the problem? This shows you, as of today, I took these figures this morning, what our international sovereign bonds are. Because the secondary market is giving us price signals that if we were to have any reissuances, how these bonds would be priced. So we have about something like $14.5 billion outstanding. And the price that you see, this was issued at 100. So the prices that you see, that the longer duration ones are at a lower price, around about 55, and the shorter durations are a little bit higher. The middle and the right hand graphs show you time series analysis of these bonds. The middle one is the more near term, which is coming up in 9 months, and the last one is a 2030. So there has been a significant reduction in prices. So markets are signaling that they are perceiving distress. Now, I know one of the criticisms that have been put forward is that these prices that have been reflected here are not indicative of large volumes. But I did take it out of the Bloomberg terminal that on Wednesday, about $191 million of face value traded. On Thursday, it was about 15 million. And on Friday, it's 33 million. So the argument that it's not a fair market does not really hold. Maybe you have distressed sellers, that's a different matter. But there is liquidity in the market, and the prices that the market are signaling have to be taken into account. They cannot be dismissed that it is due to illiquidity. So one of the other challenges that we have is this shows you the ratings that the country has got from the 3 major ratings over the last 15 years. And right on the top is the Moody's. So the recent rating cut was a double notch reduction. And when we initially initiated with Moody's, we were at B1. We are now down to CAA. The other rating companies, Fitch and S&P, have still not revised their ratings. They had a rating downgrade earlier this year. It remains to be seen whether they will follow Moody's. Now, I don't have the, so what does these ratings mean? A rating basically tells you about probability of default. So it's signaling to investors that how you should price the instrument, taking into account the impairment risk. And this is something that I have compiled from an S&P study. So this is not Moody's, this is S&P. And we are still at a B rating at S&P. And this shows you a probability of default. So the good news is at their rating of B, the downgrade probability is 3% within 1 year. And within 3 years, the probability is yet remains about 3%. But if you get downgraded to the next notch, which is triple C, the probability of a selected default is 42%. Now, if you assume that Moody's CAA is analogous to a triple C, it is signaling to us that there is a 42% probability of default based on the S&P historical 25-year analysis. The good news is there's a higher probability that we will not default. So this particular chart shows you what has happened, why this debt to GDP went to this level, and this is an attribution analysis of the key drivers. So the debt to GDP is a numerator and a denominator, and you have a numerator which is the debt and the denominator GDP. So over a long period of time, there are various elements that drive this metric. One of them being the primary balance, that means the revenue minus expenditure without interest. Then you have the exchange rate, because almost 50% previously of the debt was designated in foreign currency, and when the currency depreciates, you get a large increase in the debt. You can see that in 2018, the pink shows the exchange rate effect. That was when this famous Democles index report came out and the currency depreciated about 16% during the constitutional crisis. You can see a few pink. So some of the drivers that have been driving this is every time we have a large adjustment in the currency, this increases the rupee value of the debt stock. But we also have an effect called the real interest rate effect, where because our growth rate has been slowing over the last few years, the difference between the real interest rate and the growth has also been contributing to it. So previously we were able to escape the problem by growing faster than the real interest rate on our debt, which was predominantly domestic. And then we had concessionary multilateral financing. But when we started borrowing in the market, basically, the real interest rate costs started increasing and our growth started coming down. So that also was a drag on this debt to GDP metric. This kind of shows you, because there's a lot of arguments going on how this debt came about. You know, at the end of 1998, that's about 21 years ago, the total debt in rupee terms was about 1 trillion. And by the end of 2019, the debt was 13 trillion. So in that period, so after independence, for almost 50 years, we added 1 trillion. Of course, it's not the same rupees because we keep depreciating the currency and there's inflation on it. But in this last 21 years, we added something like 12 trillion of debt. Now, the biggest contribution to the debt, something like 60%, has come from the compounding of interest. So, you know, this interest that has accumulated over a long period of time is now, the debt that has accumulated over a long period of time is now compounding. And the second largest contributor has been the reduction in the currency. And then the budgetary deficits, mainly the primary deficits that have also added to the debt. So what is snowballing the debt is more the interest rate and exchange rate effects than the continuing primary deficits that we are posting. And at a later time, I will show you that it was primary deficits that we posted in the first 30 years of our existence after independence that started piling up. And then the interest started kicking in. So as Einstein said, compound. And so then comes the solutions. Now the first solution that the problem that we have is this debt is designated in US dollars. And typically on a steady state condition, if you take the current account deficit plus FDI, we have a funding deficit of about $1.3 billion a year. So we need to keep borrowing $1.3 billion to bridge this deficit. Now what the policymakers have done in the short term is basically they have, and this shows you what the kind of resources we have in terms of foreign exchange to meet our external liabilities. And you can see that in Sri Lanka's case, if you take the debt to the reserves that we have, is basically reserves only cover about 20% of the debt. But if you look at some peer countries, their position is significantly better because they are not so indebted externally, because they have a lot of external assets as well. The imbalance between external assets and external liabilities is not so great as in Sri Lanka's case. So this shows you from the available data what is happening on the current account system. So at the margin, at the moment, the central bank has been able to accumulate reserves because there are, first of all, there are import controls. We have also had some fairly healthy remittance flows that have come in because probably all these people who are coming back to Sri Lanka are repatriating their balances. Tourism has completely gone down, but tourism also generates a lot of imports because there's a lot of imported consumption that happens. And exports, luckily, has held up. And imports have benefited mainly due to reduction in commodity prices, oil prices, and we have also imposed some import control. So at the margin, the current account is not depleting our reserves. It is the debt servicing that is affecting our reserves. Now the problem is that you can't continue that strategy indefinitely because imports have an import multiplier. So for example, to give you an indication that in 2017 and 18, the vehicle imports alone cost the country about $1 billion. But there was close to 200 billion rupees worth of taxes that were collected. Now, if you stall vehicle imports, which we have done, and I haven't seen the statistics for the month of September because the person at the RMB has not turned up to work, the tax revenue that has been collected on car imports, which are stopped about three months ago, that source of revenue is no longer available to the government, which means that it is significantly making the problem even more. And it's roughly about 12% of revenue that comes from car taxes. You also have a significant multiplier that happens from imports. For example, you get the tax benefit, but when you import a car, that vehicle dealers make profits. You know, you have a registration, you have a financing because about 60 to 70% of vehicles are leased. There's an insurance element, so that entire multiplier that comes from imports is lost. So that again is going to affect economic growth and ability to raise further taxes from economic activity. Now, the other problem that we have is our banks also basically own 10% of international sovereign bonds, right? And this graph shows you the ownership amongst some of the banks. It's not all of the banks, and I don't have other. My estimate is about 10% of the stock is owned by them. So any decline in the prices are going to significantly affect the profitability also, although they have at the moment parked it in what is called amortized cost, and they don't have to necessarily recognize these market prices. But it's a matter of time before this will also flow into their balance sheet. The next problem that we have is that this shows you, Dhananath, who are the other countries of a similar rating and what kind of maturities are coming up. So you can have a contagion effect that it's not only us, we don't operate in isolation, at similar rated countries, if they have a credit sentiment in the market for our issuances. Now, how would you address this? One issue is your budget. Right, and we have to look at the primary balance, which is revenue minus primary expenditure without interest. Since independence, only 4 years, 1954, 1955, 2017 and 2018, did we post a primary balance surplus. The revenue was not sufficient enough to meet primary expenditure, which is without interest. And why we should look at that is what a government can control, because the interest is something that you accumulate on a previous budget, and therefore we have not been able to post a primary balance surplus. And what is the main reason for that? Well, the main reason for that is because basically our tax to GDP, which used to be about 19% about 21 years ago, has declined to something like 12%, 12.5%. And the expectation is that it will go down to about 9% this year. The huge reduction is because there were certain tax policy changes made towards the end of last year, but also a slowdown in the economy affects profitability because profits do come down. And the discretionary consumption on which the incident of taxation is also higher has also come down. So all these factors are leading to a significant decline in tax revenue. And therefore, basically, we are going to run a record deficit this year, which is estimated to about 10% of GDP. And this primary balance deficit would be a blowout deficit of about 4%. And the expectation is that there won't be a full recovery in some of the tax policies. The economy is probably not going to fully recover in 2021. It is more likely we will have to wait till 2022 for a full recovery to happen. So what are the medium term impacts that we can do? Obviously, we have to get economic growth to increase. And economic growth is a function of what is called factor accumulation, which is that you increase the number of people who are employed. We also have a large labor supply of female labor. The female labor participation rate is only 35% in the economy. We also have to generate more savings, domestic savings, by deferring consumption and using those savings judiciously to invest in high return projects. And then the mother of all problems, which should be at the tip of all Sri Lankans' tongues, is about productivity. The game is all about productivity, and we have to get productivity up. Our productivity has been declining for the last 20 years. And there are three drivers of productivity. One is technical progress, and it's not about buying the best available machine in the market, but applying what we already have and best practices that we already have and appropriate technology. So to give you a simple example, something like drip irrigation in agriculture, so that whatever water resources we have, appropriately we put it when the plant needs it. We also have to allow restructuring, which means that new ways of doing things. And we also have to reskill our population for them to get skills up. The issue is that increasing economic growth through productivity is a 5-year to 10-year journey. That is not a light switch that you can put on next year. But in order to allow productivity to improve, there is one key driver, Dhananath. And the most important driver is competition. We have to allow competition and contestability to happen in our economy. So you have to permit more competition in non-tradable goods. And in tradable goods, we have to allow more competition and, most important, contestability through trade. So we can't be excessively protecting industries and saying that let's do things domestically and self-sufficiency. We have to get our companies exposed to international competition and get them to reduce waste and improve the way they do things. And finally, I'm afraid there is only one game in town to get out of this problem. That is that we have to go for an IMF program. Why do we need to go to an IMF program? As I have tried to explain to you, we have lost access to the international markets. So the debt maturities that are coming up, we cannot go to the market to refinance it. That window has been shut. At a credit rating of CAA and at yields of 20% and higher, we can't go and reissue debt. There may be an opportunity of one or two, avenues. Short-term liquidity support may be forthcoming, like swaps, but that is certainly a liquidity support and it is not a solvency support. By going to an IMF, you get the funds at an interest rate of 0.1%, right? So the coupons on the bonds that we are replacing are between 6 and 7%. But IMF money does not come with any conditions. These conditions are not to penalize Sri Lanka, but to put us in the right path so that we increase the credibility in the eyes of international investors. On the back of an IMF program and an IMF supervision, more investors are willing to lend to us because the credibility improves. They know that there is an umbrella as a supervisor overlooking it. And we have gone to the IMF since 1965. We have been there 16 times before. So I don't think there is anything wrong in going for the 17th time. And there is something called an exceptional funding window, which comes to about 500% of our quota. Our quota is about $800 million. That will put the funding cap at about $4 billion. And the difference between the exceptional funding category is that in the normal funding category, you can only draw down 150% of your quota. which I don't think in the short term will be enough with the kind of crisis that we are facing. So that is why I believe we will have to probably go for an exceptional facility. So I went on a fairly lengthy argument, but I hope I have set the foundation for more discussion from the other panelists going forward.
Thank you, Murtaza. Thank you very much. Just to summarize before we move on to a commercial break. So Dr. Wijewardhena highlighted it's not only the government debt, there's a private sector debt that the export businesses and taking letter of credits and operating the private sector businesses will be challenging. And Murtaza basically said that the interest rate is a problem and we haven't maintained a primary balance over the after independence except for 4 years, and the solution that he sees is this the short-term liquidity problem is difficult to maintain in the coming years. So one option is to consider the IMF, since we have gone there for the last 16 we have gone there for 16 times, probably about 42% of our time after independence, after we took the membership from IMF. So those are the suggestions and discussion points that we discussed before the break. We are planning to discuss about the state minister has also made a statement sharing his opinion why investors should not confuse and why investors remain confident about Sri Lanka's debt sustainability.
A force filled with commitment, 2 years of volunteerism and sacrifice. The time has come to form a force for your area. Transform yourself to lead your locality. Register now with 20 volunteers who wish to be a part of your team. Visit www.weforce.lk or dial 0777 600 20 to be a proud member of WeForce.
Come at the WeForce.
Welcome back. You're watching News First. Today, our discussion is Sri Lanka's economy in peril, and what is the situation of Sri Lanka's debt sustainability is our discussion today. And our panelists today are Dr. W.A. Wijewardhena. He's the former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank. Mr. Chandra Jayaratne, he is the former chairman of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, and Mr. Murtaza Jafferjee, he is the chairman of Advocata Institute, and he's also the CEO of JB Securities. In the first round, we went in depth on understanding the problem, and the basic outline is it's not only the government debt, there's a private sector debt, and at the same time that's going to impact the private businesses, and the interest payment and the magnifying interest payment is a main issue, and we have to maintain a primary balance, and we have to build the credibility as a solution to lend more money and roll it over. And Murtaza suggested that we have to consider going back to IMF, and when you go for an IMF program, there's a higher chance that credibility factor will be built in, and there's a higher chance that we can get more favorable loan conditions from the market. So that was the first layer of the discussion. I would like to move to Dr. Wijewardhena to ask my next question. Dr. Wijewardhena, there's a sentiment among people. How does this debt issue impacting a common man? Because they believe in Sinhala you call it api kawot api hamba karanawa. If I earn, I can bring food onto the table. So if government pays the debt or whether they have higher debt, it doesn't impact me because I have to earn for myself. So Dr. Wijewardhena, actually, is there impact on common man, and how does this debt situation affects the common person?
Dhananath, I think you have raised the very important, pertinent question here, because unless you feel it to yourself, you don't feel that the country is indebted, and however much the experts may be telling the common man that you are indebted, and as a result you will have to make a huge sacrifice, people don't feel it. But after some time, the common man will have to bear the entire burden, because what has happened in the past, that Sri Lanka had been able to pay the foreign debt not by generating resources from inside, compounding the entire, because earned by ourselves, so we have to borrow from abroad. So that is why when the foreign debt at the time of independence was about say 4% of Sri Lanka's GDP, which has now gone up to, if you add the private debt also, it has gone up to say 80% of our GDP now. So so it has been a huge problem, because the problem has been that the common man doesn't understand that he has to make the final payment. Now, of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic and also the disruption to the entire external sector, exports and the services, foreign direct investments and our ability to borrow, our balance of payments has become under very critical situation. So the country now will have to go for import controls. Once the import controls are there, it's actually a forced savings, because once what would happen is people, instead of consuming the goods that are produced in other countries, now they will have to do away with those consumption. Already the turmeric we have done away with it. Now coconuts we have done away with it. So likewise, people will have to tighten their belt if the country goes for a massive import control system, the system which we had before 1977, where we had actually practically controlled the entirety of our imports in the country. So at that time, of course, the common man and the big man will often satisfy their requirements by getting imported goods from other sources. But the common man doesn't have this particular one, and specifically the problem will arise if we have to control the importation of medicines, control the importation of fuel, control the importation of basic food items like the wheat flour, because the entirety of the state sector and the people in the north will suffer out of that. So this is the time where the common man will have to suffer. Now we have come to that situation because we are no longer in a position to borrow abroad in order to make the payments that are due from us, because we don't have foreign exchange. As I mentioned in my first presentation, the total country foreign reserves, if you exclude the gold reserve, which is about say 400 million US dollars, it has come down to 5.1 billion US dollars, and we have to use 5.1 billion US dollars to meet an obligation of 7 billion US dollars. So we have a shortfall. So necessarily Sri Lanka has to now impose more and stricter import controls, and once we impose them, then only the common man will find that අපි හොයාගත්තත් කන්න බෑ කියන තත්වයට they will come, because they will come to a situation where they can't even eat whatever they have produced, that they have earned. So that is where we have to make the biggest sacrifice. But that sacrifice should come not only from the common man, it should come from the entire all the people in the country, including the politicians, the government. The government has to cut down its budget, because Murtaza has very clearly said that our budget deficit in this year is a record deficit of 10% of GDP, with the primary balance going up to 4%. And the most alarming situation is our current account balance, the revenue account balance, which is the difference between the government revenue and the government's consumption. It is going up to about say 8% of our GDP. So, which is a very tricky situation. So, government has to cut down its current expenditure. All the unnecessary expenses will have to be postponed for at least for another 3 to 4 year time period. So that is where the common man will feel the brunt of the present debt crisis.
Dr. Wijewardhena, before I move to Mr. Chandra Jayaratne, there is also a sentiment and even actually I should do the justice for the State Minister of Capital Markets, Honorable Ajit Niwad Cabral. He issued a statement yesterday. Of course, there are certain stretches, but the investors should not panic and confuse. Even he mentioned during 2001 to 2004, 2005, that period, we had a debt to GDP ratio above 100%. So they have managed, Sri Lanka has managed to overcome that situation, and we have a clean record of debt servicing without any default. So if we have done it before, why can't we do it this time? And what is different this time is my question before I move to Mr. Jayaratne.
Well, in fact, the politicians who are in power will have to build up confidence among the people, and therefore I don't find anything wrong in what Mr. Cabral has issued in his statement. But the main difference is, it is not the debt to GDP ratio which matters. What matters is, if you take the government, central government debt, what matters is the government revenue versus the amount that we have to pay to outsiders. So there we have come to a very critical situation because we don't have rupee funds, because the revenue will fall to about say 8% of GDP because of the two reasons. Reason number one is the attractive tax concessions given by the present government when it came to power. Second one is the COVID-19 pandemic, which has actually shrunk the economy also. Now, we haven't got the second quarter and the third quarter economic growth data, but as it is, it may be a massive shrinkage of Sri Lanka's economy. When the economy shrinks, the government also will lose its revenue. So because of these two reasons, the government revenue will fall, and the government's debt obligations are actually as they were before. So as a result, the ability of meeting the current debt obligations out of the current revenue is very remote for Sri Lanka. So that is the difference between today and in 2001. So we have to keep in our mind that the revenue base, that's why I said, in order to bring necessary resources to the table and repay the maturing debt, we have to have a huge shrinkage of the current expenditure of the government. Without that, we cannot do that.
Thank you, Dr. Wijewardhena. Next, I move my attention to Mr. Jayaratne. Mr. Jayaratne, there is also the government has provided an assurance for the diaspora in Sri Lanka to remit their money in foreign currency, and they have provided an assurance of a payback. And can this bridge that 2 billion, approximately 2 to 3 billion deficit that Dr. Wijewardhena spoke about? And is there any possibility that we can go to a neighboring country like China, Japan, or India and match our shortage and overcome this situation? Or are there any other solutions from the private sector perspective to overcome this situation? That's my question to you, Mr. Jayaratne.
Well, we can go to India and China and get currency swap now. And secondly, it is very costly. What we need is export-driven real exchange earnings or services-driven, or we need to get it in the form of our expenditure on imports going down. But I'd like to go back to the question that you raised from Vijay, but looking at it from a foreign investor's point of view. Now, I've had recent investors ringing me on some of these, so I'd like to bring them out so that people will understand the sentiments of the people. We are saying we want FDI, we want SDA, what you are saying, the people to come and deposit money, since the bankers and the outside world is asking some questions. I think it's important for these to be known not only by the public but by those who are leading the country. First is, a Singaporean bank has asked the question of a fertilizer importer into this country. They have asked, is there a default possible? Will the banks of Sri Lanka be solvent? Can you accept their letters of credit? Will you get paid if the government brings this and gives it free, the fertilizer, or gives it at such subsidy? Will you get paid? And if you don't get paid, will we get paid? So all this is being added, they are adding risk elements in dealing. So that shows the sentiments about, especially after the double default of Moody's and the recent US reactions which was talked about by Murtaza. There is very sensitive sentiments which are being expressed by investors, foreign banks, and those who deal with Sri Lanka. And the biggest question they're asking is, why did we turn down the IMF grant which had been the last tranche? We said no, or we will refer, we'll renegotiate, and still we have not gone to get, which as Murtaza showed, why are this country not taking? This is a question they're asking. Do they know something that they don't want to go to IMF? What does the government want to hide away from IMF? This is a question being raised by those who are giving credit to this country. Then they're asking the question, is it a cash flow crisis or is it an insolvency? is the country able in the end to pay? That is why I have asked the president, I have asked the president and others to be told whether upon a fiscal gap calculation, that is to know whether all our future earnings taken, net earnings taken, discounted to today, whether we can meet our present liabilities, which means if not, we are insolvent today and we may have to take a different course of action. We can't go on as a going concern. Then the tax changes that have been made. We are one of the low tax paying economies in the world. They are asking in your revenue issue, why did you reduce taxes at this stage? Finally, the reason to attract this SDA, what you were talking about, the government has offered an exchange hedge. Now, if you come today and invest in Sri Lanka, the day you want to take it out, we'll give it to you at that exchange rate, irrespective of tomorrow's. Now, therefore, they are asking, what does it signal? Is there a big hedge premium that the government is taking? If so, can the government bear it? How shall we bear in future contracting with Sri Lanka? So, they are asking, look, if we have invested in debt, we can sell the debt today, bring it back and get the new debt at the new offer that has been made to pay on a guaranteed exchange rate. But those who came and invested in 2018 and 2015, 2016, these last few years, exchange rate has gone down. When they take it out, they will never get their investment. They made a FDI investment. Really, they are starting against a new investor. What is our competitiveness having come and invested in this country? Should we have reliability? This is a question asked of me by a multinational company who had a foolish mistake, I think, of trying to attract investments and debt by doing away with WHT, withholding tax. If you take the total withholding tax, and if we haven't seen the final tax bill, but they have announced it, if foreigners are able to take the whole of the interest away, or the whole of their dividends away without any withholding tax, those who are, we are a country as a country, why are you losing? You have double tax agreements with tax-sparing clauses, which means the other country, what you tax you claim here from your foreign investor, they can get it back in their country under the double tax treaty. Did not that your government know that there are double tax treaties and the tax-sparing clauses? Why are you giving the benefit of tax-sparing clauses and double tax treaty to that question? Then they are asking the question, will Sri Lankan banks be solvent in the longer term? Can we rely upon Sri Lankan banks in our trading? And finally, they ask a very important question. Are the leaders of Sri Lanka aware of the real, true nature of your debt issues? Are they blind, or are they trying to talk to the market, or are they planning on something else to get loans and enter into some corrupt dealings? Because first thing you should have been doing is to control the transfer pricing mechanism. The leakage from this country of foreign exchange through transfer pricing problems, which are not attended to by the tax department, are well known to those who investigated the frauds and the losses of this country. All which is well known is the Sri Lanka deal, where the government itself was told by a foreign country that there was a bribe paid. So these leaks, why are they not being plugged? Why are the leaks not being plugged? Is it that the government is aware of the problem but wants to compound for their benefit? Now, I think investors are not blind, and I am wondering whether it is an awareness issue, or is it that those who are advising the leaders are advising it with some personal benefit or personal ego in their mind? So until that is resolved, I'm afraid the truth and tomorrow are both going to be doubtful.
Thank you, Mr. Jayaratne. Thank you for those wonderful thoughts. I move my attention now to Murtaza. Murtaza, is there a way that we can reprofile the debt? Can't we go back to our creditors and tell them we are having a problem because of the COVID situation and we contain the first round really well? Can't we go and ask them, can you give us like additional 1 year or 2 year? And does it consider as default? That's my question number one. And also I would like to address in society there is another, I don't know whether it's called a myth or there's a sentiment that if Japan can maintain about 179% or 239% debt to GDP ratio, why can't Sri Lanka maintain like Japan? If Japan can do it, what's the problem with we having 100%? So I would like to get answers for those two questions, Murtaza.
For the benefit of our audience, let me explain what a reprofile. It's a rearrangement of the timing of cash flows as opposed to a clipping or haircutting of the quantum of the cash flow. So reprofiling would mean that whatever payments that we have to make in the near term, maybe in the next few years or 3 years, that it is postponed. There's a moratorium. It is something that has been done in many other countries, and it is something that we have to seriously consider, because that will give us breathing space, that if we go for a reprofiling, that until our economy recovers from COVID, which is not only a problem that Sri Lanka has, which is a global problem, and until we reverse some of these tax reductions and get these reforms done in our economy to grow faster so that we generate more resources and especially foreign exchange resources to be in a better position to service this debt, it is definitely something on the table. And probably I am guessing that it will be a conditionality of an IMF agreement, because they will conduct a debt sustainability analysis on Sri Lanka, or they may have already done a debt sustainability analysis on Sri Lanka, and their results may be indicative that the debt is not sustainable. And since the IMF is a fund and they lend to a country, their primary requirement is to ensure that the country can repay them. So reprofiling is something that is definitely on the table, and it is something that we should seriously consider. If you do a simple NPV analysis on international sovereign bonds and do a moratorium of 3 years, the NPV impact depending on the coupon, so it's not sensitive to the maturity of the instrument, because you're pushing back the cash flows, is between 18% and 22%. Our bonds are trading at 56 cents to the dollar, 60 cents to the dollar. So the reprofiling will actually have an impact significantly lower than what the market is construing that the cost will. So many of these investors will actually significantly benefit. The thing is, it's a misplaced sense of vanity that says that we should not do that. To me, if you don't do that, the burden of the adjustment is more on the domestic economy, and it will be left, because the longer you postpone it, you have what is called a subordination problem that happens. So the remaining creditors are going to take a bigger hit. So that is the essence of a reprofile.
When you go for a reprofiling, is it a form of default, and would the investor confidence will be further reprofiling?
Yes. So it's called a selected default, and the way the markets are pricing, they're already expecting, and reprofiling actually will be seen as a more positive event. But the problem is that reprofiling just does not happen on our own decision. We have to get the creditors to agree, and for the creditors to agree, they have to feel that our proposals are credible. So they have to see us taking concrete measures that we are significantly going to improve our debt sustainability position, and they will also draw comfort from the fact that if an IMF program comes in subsequently, that the probability of us coming out of this situation would be also more favorable. And the thing is that most of our instruments, Dhananath, have something called collective action clauses, so that beyond a certain threshold of people who agree, then you can't have a minority of investors or what are called holdouts saying that I'm not agreeable to whatever agreement that the majority has. And I'm told that 50% of our bonds have what are called group collective action clauses, which means that you have to take the entirety of the ISBs beyond a certain threshold, if they agree, then everybody has to agree. But 50% don't have that group collective action clauses, although they have collective action clauses on a particular bond series. So it is a selective default. The market is already signaling to us that they're expecting one. But if we go for a 3-year moratorium, it will actually be a lesser burden than what the market is signaling. And your second question was?
The Japan example, yes.
So the issue with the Japan is that Japanese interest rates are negative. So although they have a debt to GDP of something like 220%, the cost of servicing that debt is around 1% of GDP because interest rates are almost negative. And it costs about 10 to 15% of revenue to service the interest. Sri Lanka's debt to GDP is going to be close to 100%. We spend about 900 billion rupees last year, out of which 2/3 was domestic interest rates and 1/3 are foreign interest rates, which was costing us about 40 to 45%. This year, that cost of servicing the interest is expected to be about 70%. So Japan spends about 1% of GDP on interest, Sri Lanka spends about 6% of GDP. So it is not necessarily the debt to GDP that matters, but the servicing cost. On that, at 6% of GDP, we are off the charts.
Thank you, Murtaza. We have moved to our last 7 minutes, so I would like to get Dr. Wijewardhena's final round of comments. Dr. Wijewardhena, the question that I have in mind is, the interest rates have come down significantly low under this in the previous couple of months. So one argument that I also mentioned by the government is that because of the interest rates are low, now our interest payment cost, especially for the domestic debt, has come down. So isn't that a positive? Is my question, and you can conclude your views in this round, Dr. Wijewardhena.
Yes, Dhananath, the interest rates are actually a double-edged sword. It will cut you in either side. You now, of course, when the interest rates have come down, the government will have to spend only a smaller amount of money for the payment of interest on public debt. But remember, the interest rates are simply paid to people who provide for loans to government also. And we have on one side, we have lenders, on the other side, we have the borrowers. So as a borrower, the government is benefited. But if the lenders are not appropriately compensated for what the sacrifice they have made, then they will not actually save money, and as a result, they will spend money, and it will have other implications for the government. The Sri Lanka's exchange rate will be under pressure for depreciation, and our inflation rate would be higher. So what matters is that whether the interest rate is low or not. What matters to us is whether the real interest rate is positive or negative. Given the present inflation rate of around 6.5% in the whole country, the National Consumer Price Index, and when the government borrows around, say, 4%, as you have mentioned in your previous initial slide, the biggest loser is the Employees Provident Fund, the members of the Employees Provident Fund, and the members of the Employees Trust Fund, because they are getting a negative rate of return for the money that they have saved. And it happens to the commercial bank, depositors in the commercial banks also, because the current interest rates at commercial banks are around, say, 4 to 5%. So they also are getting a negative one. So when the interest rates are lower, what happens is we have to be mindful of the fact that the real interest rate should be positive. At least it should be positive by about 3%, so that there is any disincentive for savers to save, and also there's no disincentive for borrowers to borrow. So therefore, the low interest rates is a double-edged sword, and it will cut us on both sides.
Thank you, Dr. Wijewardhena. Mr. Jayaratne, how does this impact the common man? I know you explained how the impact for the investors, the foreigners, and for the businesses. But what is your view on someone who runs a small shop at a small town, someone who does like a daily wage earning small occupation? What would be the impact, Mr. Jayaratne?
The small man is going to suffer by a number of ways. Prices are bound to rise if the exchange comes under and the exchange rate keeps on moving. The interest rates may be low, but the ability to save and pay is going to be very, very difficult. And even if a person wants to start a new business, the banks may have large losses to be booked according to the current accounting standards because of the deferred credit that has been given. Leasing companies will not be leasing easily. The financial interest rates have come down, which means what is happening is that the informal lenders are taking a large sum. So the risks of the banks, risks of financial institutions, risks of then people who are, the informal money lenders to the society is going to also impact on all our people. What I really feel is that there could even be, if basic supplies of food and other essentials do not become available, COVID related or because of these exchange related issues, including medicines, and they talked about the need for flour, but there are other things which people really need which we cannot grow in this country. There is a time gap between grow locally and really getting the food to the table. So those who don't have that, and if suddenly the government starts cutting back on their subsidies, electricity prices, water prices, all these will go up, and the common man is going to have an effect. But to me, the biggest effect is going to be if people go hungry. I think the possibilities of food riots to law and order defaults, and thereby some kinds of rioting situations are not impossible to rule out. But to me, the most important thing is, can our leaders be transparent, talk about these issues in parliament without blaming each other? And I would say they must show that they are placing the nation first and its people first before governance, power, or even anything else. If we do not give that right signals to the people and bring them all together to fight this battle, I think we are going to have a very difficult tomorrow, even as individuals, business, or as a country.
Thank you, Mr. Jayaratne. Murtaza, my last question to you is, there are two sides. One is the Colombo Stock Exchange has been doing really well over the last few weeks. So if there's a debt concern, how come the Colombo Stock Exchange performing really well? And also, I would also like to ask you the question, there were some sentiments, there have been multiple reports by international financial institutes like Moody's, the rating agency, and there were two reports by Morgan and Stanley and JB Morgan. Some people even question whether is there a conspiracy to release multiple reports back to back. And I would like to get your opinion on those two aspects with your final concluding thoughts.
Okay, so Dhananath, first your question about the stock market. Now, market prices go up at the margin. So the reason sometimes prices go up is that there is more demand than supply. And let's kind of understand what's driving that. So the graph that I'm sharing on the left-hand side shows you what has happened to government security yields. That in a period of about 1.5 years, there has been a dramatic reduction in interest rates, which you can see. And it has also been witnessed that there is a huge increase in liquidity, that it has increased to about 150 to 200 billion. What caused that? So first is that the policy rates have been significantly reduced. There were about two reductions in policy rates. And the statutory reserve ratio, which used to be about 6% in this period, has now been brought down to about 2%. So that amount of deposits that banks have to keep with the central bank has been reduced by 1/3, and it has created an excess liquidity situation in the banking system. So the availability and the price of money has significantly come down. The next shows you what happened to bank interest rates, because most households in Sri Lanka save through the banking system. The other avenues of saving are quite low. The word N in this AWNLR is basically new. So it's the average weighted new lending rate. So it's at the margin, what is happening at the margin. And you can see that at the margin, there has been a dramatic reduction in rates. So even the prime rate, which is something that borrowers, the quality borrowers who probably be participating in the stock market, the cost of borrowing has come down significantly. And also the deposit rates. So the households who save, the deposit rates have come down. Although it has not fully repriced as yet, it will take some time. And you can see that on the right-hand side that the AWFDR, etc., is yet lagging. But at the margin, it is coming down significantly. So a household, Dhananath, that was used to doing nothing, who was able to earn 10-11% nominal interest rates, are now having to deal with an environment where they're getting 4.5% and 5% fixed deposit rates, which will probably also marginally come down going forward. So our household, the total stock of deposits out there is close to 10 trillion. So if a very small amount of money looks for alternate returns, that makes a big difference in a relatively illiquid market like the stock market. And this shows you what has happened to the stock market. So pre-COVID, after the COVID lockdown, that there was a significant crash in the market, right? So even leading to COVID lockdown, there was a significant contraction because the global COVID crisis was raging at that moment. And then we have seen a dramatic recovery. So the dramatic recovery was that the initial knee-jerk reaction was very excessive, that there was quite literally dumping, and mainly from foreign investors. And we have seen continuous selling from foreign investors. And then we have seen a dramatic recovery in the indices. But if you take the benchmark indices, which is the S&P, which has a fairly high weightage to banking, and that shows you the attribution and analysis on the right-hand side, that what drove the index, you can see that the financials, which compose about 40 to 50% of the index, is still significantly down. But since it has a large weight, it is dragging it down. So the market basically is perceiving that the banking sector, which is the largest representation of the stock market, is going to have stress going forward. There's about 8 to 9 trillion of loans out there. And as of 30th September, close to 2 trillion or a little bit higher of was in moratorium. And in the next few weeks, we will see what the performance levels are on those loans. So the market is signaling to us that they are very concerned about the outlook for financial firms. But COVID also has created COVID winners. So some firms have significantly benefited from COVID. And especially if you take companies that have been in the air freight business, because there's been record amount of an increase in the rates, because the passenger aircraft have come down and it is only the cargo carriers that are available. They have seen a huge increase in earnings. Some companies have also benefited from the measures taken by the government in terms of import controls. So the imports at the margins are creating competition. So in the case of things like cement, they have imposed a cess of 150 rupees on an imported bag of cement, which has taken that competition out, and therefore it has created a better opportunity for domestic firms to produce more and a more favorable pricing environment, and which has led to record profits. We have also seen a lot of activity going on in low price stocks. And we've got a lot of new investors who have also come on the market, especially a lot of young investors with fairly small amounts of money, but many of them. So the stock market is a story of two sides. That a significant amount of the larger firms, you have not seen a significant improvement in performance, especially in the banks. But a lot of some of the COVID winners and some of these stocks that are low price, which gives you a speculative opportunity, you have seen a significant boom. And that boom is mainly driven by low interest rates. The policymakers who have reduced interest rates probably have expectations that they will go into productive investments or reduce the cost of borrowing for some of the highly indebted firms. But invariably, some of it is going to go into asset markets. And what we are seeing in the stock market is a reaction to inflation in asset prices, which is going on globally also, that you have seen a huge surge in stock prices globally because of this huge central bank stimulus through lower rates. And your second question was about the reports, right? So last night also somebody sent me Barclays report a few days before. There was a report from UBS, and JP Morgan had a report, Morgan Stanley had a report. The first report I read was Citibank. So the first thing is, it's great that these companies, international banks who are the blue ribbon institutions, are covering Sri Lanka. And I was pleasantly surprised that so much of effort is going in to cover us. Second thing is that I don't think all these people have a coordinated activity. The reality is that we have $14 to $15 million of issuances out there, and all these people do business with all international buy-side firms, and it is their role basically as gatekeepers to put out reports because they have to guide their investors. It just seems to happen that, you know, the Moody's event downgrade is a catalyst for them to release reports. So they are basically speculating, they're giving forward guidance of what they think the trajectory is going to go forward. So we have to look at it in that spirit, that they are just simply doing their job. You know, sometimes they give us kudos when we are doing well, and sometimes they have to find fault with us. We can't go to quarrel with them.
Thank you very much for joining this discussion. Dr. W.A. Wijewardhena, the former governor of the Central Bank, Mr. Chandra Jayaratne, former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, and Mr. Murtaza Jafferjee, the chairman of Advocata Institute and the CEO of JB Securities. The summary is, it's not only the government debt, there's a private sector debt that we have to pay. And the problem, how does it affect the common man, is it will affect across your lifestyle and the life cycle, starting from your food, starting from borrowing money from a bank, starting from starting a business, and your entire earnings and your entire lifestyle will be affected with this debt sustainability. And ultimately, it is you, the people, and we, the people, have to pay this debt. And what are the solutions we have, which Murtaza spoke about? There are two sides. One is we can go for an immediate solution, that is, we can go back to IMF and make sure that Sri Lanka is good for money and bring more investors and roll out debt. That's option number one. And there's another option that we can go and reprofile our debt and take a moratorium for about 3 months. Those both solutions are short term, and in long term there is no way we can come out of this problem unless we improve our productivity and unless we grow our economy. For that, we have to call for hard reforms, and we have to go through the pain, and which may affect everyone and which will be difficult. But the important thing is, our policy making unit should have the courage to make that decision and drive and lead the people in the right direction. And as Ayn Rand said, sometimes you can avoid the reality, but the consequences of the reality is very difficult to avoid. With that note, we'll leave from your discussion table. I'm Dhananath Fernando, and today the discussion topic is Sri Lanka's economy in peril, and we are looking forward to join a similar discussion in future. Till then, you have a pleasant evening and good night.